Chapter 48, Chapter 48, Stranger by the Fire. 1264, Deep Mountain Pass close to Caer Morhen. Triss's POV. Triss covered her eyes with a gloved hand, trying to shield them from the heavy, relentless onslaught of snow she was currently wading through. She couldn't be quite sure, but she was pretty certain the blizzard was actually getting even worse. She didn't ponder it for long, though, as she was currently focusing all of her magical and mental energy on just keeping herself warm enough not to freeze to death, and shielding herself and her poor, exhausted horse with as much protective magic as she possibly could. Sadly, even her considerable magical abilities had their limits, and she was pretty sure she was rapidly closing in on them. Blast it all, she murmured to herself, her breath frosting in the frigid air. She had been so close, so sure she would make it to the ancient Witcher Keep before the worst of the storm hit. She had either timed her journey poorly, or the storm had sped up with unnatural ferocity. Either way, she was now well and truly stuck in it. She patted her mind-numbed horse on its icy side and urged it to keep moving forward, which it did, albeit at an extremely, agonizingly slow rate. However, just as quickly and as inexplicably as the blizzard had seemed to descend upon her, it was suddenly gone. Triss looked around in utter confusion. The storm was still raging all around her, a howling, white-out vortex of wind and snow, yet there seemed to be some sort of invisible, magical dome she had just entered, a dome that was keeping the blizzard completely at bay. She knew the spell that could do this, of course, a powerful, advanced version of a weather-warding charm, though she herself wouldn't have been able to hold it for very long, and certainly not long enough to make it all the way to Caer Morhen. She looked around, searching for the powerful sorcerer or sorceress who could have possibly put up such a massive, stable dome. She looked up at the shimmering, invisible roof of the dome, then back down to the ground. Where there had once been a treacherous, snow-covered path, there now sat a man, comfortably situated next to a roaring, cheerful fireplace, which she was absolutely positive had not been there a mere moment before she had looked up. Nonetheless, with little other choice, she cautiously approached the man. If she were to be completely honest with herself, the very first thing she noticed about him was that the man looked like the complete and utter opposite of Geralt. Where Geralt had tough, rugged features and more of a roguish, world-weary look to him, this man had softer, almost boyish features, and a kind, friendly face. Where Geralt was built with solid, hard-earned muscle in every place that could possibly have muscle, this man seemed to be much skinnier, though a closer look revealed that he possessed a more lean, swimmer's type of muscle. The hair, however, was probably the most obvious, and most striking, difference. Geralt had his signature, shoulder-length ashen-white hair, whereas this man had short, impossibly messy hair that was blacker than any hair she had ever seen on anyone, save for perhaps her friend, Yennefer. After she had finished her brief, initial observation of him, she decided to walk up to him, her boots crunching softly on the snow-free ground. "Hello, stranger," Triss said, trying her best to sound polite and non-threatening. "I never thought I'd find another mage this far up in these desolate mountains. May I ask what you're doing so far north?" There was nothing up here for miles and miles, besides the crumbling ruins of Caer Morhen, and she wondered, with a flicker of suspicion, if this man had perhaps been summoned by the chapter to check on Vesemir and the other witchers as well. The black-haired, deceptively young-looking man looked up from the crackling fire and smiled charmingly at her, a warm, disarming smile. There was something almost familiar in that smile, though she couldn't quite place it. "Hello to you as well," he said, his voice pleasant and clear. "Oh, you know, I just happened to be in the neighborhood when I saw you slugging your way up this mountain, right through the heart of that nasty storm. I thought I would give you a little, magically created rest stop before you keeled over from exhaustion and froze to death." Triss wriggled. "Am I correct?" the man asked, his green eyes twinkling with a strange, knowing light. Triss's eyebrow twitched at his overly casual explanation, and she was instantly suspicious of the man. While he sounded honest enough, there was absolutely no way a mage of his apparent power just happened to be up here, in the middle of nowhere, for no reason. Could he be some sort of spy? Or perhaps an assassin, sent to intercept her? Ah, you're giving me the "is he a spy" look, the man said, his smile turning into a wry grin. Gods, you wouldn't believe how many times I have received that exact look over the years. That's why I generally like common folk so much more. You tell them that you're doing something nice for them, and they usually, without question, just believe you. You do that with a noble, or a mage, and they immediately assume you either want something from them, or you're secretly planning to kill them. What a terribly exhausting way to live one's life, don't you think? The man said, his tone one of light, detached amusement. As he spoke, he reached into a snow pile next to him and, impossibly, pulled out an ornate, expensive-looking bottle and 2 crystal glasses. She realized, with a jolt of surprise, that the bottle was a very fine, very expensive vintage of wine. That's because they are not educated enough to realize when they are being taken advantage of, Tris commented, though she decided to sit down on a log near the fire, figuring, for the moment, that the man probably didn't actually mean her any harm. Hopefully. Can't argue with that in the slightest, he said with a nod. Their ignorance, their simplicity, tends to be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they tend to not be so distrusting of the world around them, which gives them an innocent, almost sweet demeanor at times. Yet, he added, his expression not changing but his voice taking on a harder edge. I also know, from first-hand, personal experience, the sheer blackness that can hide in their souls. I know how easily they can turn from simple farmers and merchants into a jeering, hateful crowd, cheering with glee at watching a fellow sentient being be lit on fire for no other crime than simply being different. Truly, utterly disgusting. While his topic of conversation had gotten considerably darker, his expression and his light, conversational tone did not change in the slightest. While he talked, he expertly uncorked the bottle and poured her a glass of what looked like a rich, dark red wine. When it was close to a quarter full, he stopped and handed it to her. She took it, but did not drink any of it just yet. She wanted to see him drink from the bottle first. A simple, but necessary, precaution. Yes, well, Tris said, her voice a little defensive now, they are simply products of their environment, are they not? They only know how to be what they were raised as, what they were taught. She knew the common people weren't all good and kind, that they could, in fact, be downright despicable at times. But how could you expect someone to be better, to rise above their station, if you didn't give them the tools, the education, to do so? That excuse can only go so far, in my book, the man said, shaking his head slightly. I don't think it takes a great deal of education or enlightenment to realize that killing innocents is just wrong. But, enough about all that dreary stuff. Let's talk about you. How have you been, Tris? The man asked, as he took a sip of the wine directly from the bottle. Tris looked at him in open confusion, her guard lowering slightly now that she had seen him drink. I'm sorry, she said, finally taking a small, tentative sip of the wine herself. It was, as she had suspected, absolutely delicious. A fine Beauclair vintage, clearly. I don't recall us ever meeting before. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 49, Chapter 49, Black Mage Revealed? If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Tris looked at him in open confusion, her guard lowering slightly now that she had seen him drink. I'm sorry, she said, finally taking a small, tentative sip of the wine herself. It was, as she had suspected, absolutely delicious. A fine Beauclair vintage, clearly. I don't recall us ever meeting before. You don't? The man asked, a strange, almost wistful expression on his face. Oh well, perhaps I should have expected that. You had been very disoriented at the time, and you had, after all, just had an extremely traumatic experience. Plus, I had to leave rather soon after you were stabilized as well, the man said, now seeming to almost talk to himself, lost in a memory. I don't think I follow, Tris said, her voice filled with confusion as she looked closer at the man, trying to place him. He did seem sort of familiar, in a very vague, fleeting way, but she could not for the life of her say why. The man mused, his green eyes studying her intently. Maybe this will help. When we first met, you didn't quite look like this. In fact, you didn't have any hair at all. You barely had much skin still stuck to your body, either. You were covered in more severe burns and deep, ragged cuts than I had ever seen on another living person before, or since. Luckily, he added, his voice turning more clinical, more academic. They were all relatively fresh wounds. I had to take stem cells directly from your femur, replicate them extraordinarily quickly using a rather complex growth charm, and then magically reintegrate them throughout your entire body. It was, I must admit, one of the hardest, most demanding medical performances of my entire life. I think you could have legally been declared clinically dead, what was it, 4 separate times on my operating table? Dreadful, really. I kept shouting rather embarrassing, unprofessional things at you, like, I'm not going to lose you, and come on, woman, just breathe. Got a lot of very strange looks from the other healers, I can tell you. The man finished his shocking, detailed account, and then, as if it were the most normal story in the world, he drank the rest of his wine in one long gulp before casually refilling his glass. Tris could do nothing but gape at the man, her mind reeling in pure, unadulterated shock. You were the one who healed me, she finally managed to yell, her voice shrill with disbelief as she shot up from her seat, her own glass of wine spilling, unnoticed, onto the snow-free ground. The man looked up at her, a flicker of surprise in his own eyes. Whoa, calm down there, he said, his voice placating. Man, you spilled the wine. That cost me quite a pretty coin, you know. Oh, never mind. Sit down, and I'll pour you another glass. Tris, feeling a little light-headed, calmed herself as she slowly sat back down, picking up her fallen, now empty cup. Now, the man continued, his tone once again calm and friendly, to answer your question, yes. I was the one who healed you at Sodden Hill. Took 5 straight days of my absolute, undivided attention to do it, too. You were in a very bad way. I remember, Tris said quietly, her voice barely a whisper as the memories, the fragmented, nightmarish images of the battle, came flooding back. The villagers at the field hospital, they told me they had no idea how I had possibly survived. They claimed that the black mage had come out of nowhere and saved me. Though others, the more superstitious ones, seemed to think it had been some sort of ancient forest spirit that had nursed me back to health. Well, I guess some of them were right, and some of them were wrong, the man said with a shrug. I have, indeed, been known by the title of the Black Mage on occasion. And Apollo to some of the more poetically inclined folk I've helped. Tris looked appraisingly at the man in a completely new, awestruck light. The legendary, almost mythical, Black Mage, right here, in the flesh. She could count the number of credible mages on one hand who had ever even claimed to have seen him, let alone spoken to him. So, it's true then, Tris said, her voice still filled with awe. I heard rumors that you had come to Sodden after the battle and started healing many of the wounded, but I had dismissed it at the time as just a hopeful story. Indeed, he confirmed with a nod. I healed who I could, for as long as I could, and then I headed out before the inevitable political nonsense started. Speaking of which, he added, his gaze turning more analytical, I see you have healed quite well, for the most part. If you don't mind me asking, did the rather nasty scar on your upper stomach, did it ever fully heal? Triss looked down for a moment, a shadow of sadness crossing her face. No, she said, her voice a little quieter now. No, it's still there. Ah. The man said, a look of genuine regret on his face. I'm sorry to hear that. It had cut extremely deeply into you, and I also had to magically heal your intestines, your stomach, and part of your liver at almost the same time. I don't know what you were hit with, but it had been a terrible, necrotizing curse. He seemed to be reminiscing, his mind back in that bloody, chaotic field hospital. It doesn't matter now, Triss said, shaking her head. Regardless of the scar, I am eternally thankful for what you did for me that day. Or those days, I suppose. If there is any way at all that I could ever repay you, please, do not hesitate to ask. Triss said to the man, her head slightly bowed in a gesture of deep, sincere gratitude. He just waved her off, though, a dismissive, yet kind, gesture. Think nothing of it, he said. And I don't charge people for healing. It's not a commodity to be bought and sold. So please, don't feel the need to try and get even. You don't owe me a single thing. The man then stood up from his log seat. Triss looked up at him in surprise. Are you leaving already? She asked, a pang of disappointment hitting her. She had hoped to talk with her mysterious savior a bit more, to ask him so many more questions. Yes, well, he said, his charming smile returning, as I said, I only really came down to give you a bit of a rest stop from the storm before you reached Caer Morhen. If you take up your previous rate of travel, you shall probably reach it in about 45 minutes now. The man, she was just going to call him Apollo in her head, said. Wait, Triss said, a little confused. I didn't say I was going to Caer Morhen. Apollo, or possibly Harry, as he'd told Gerald his name was, just looked at her as if she were a particularly simple-minded, though endearing, child. There is, literally, nothing else except forests, mountains, and more snow in the direction you're currently going, Triss, he asked, his voice filled with gentle amusement. Where else would you be going in the middle of a blizzard like this? Triss felt her cheeks grow slightly warm at that. Ah, was all she could manage to reply, feeling a little foolish. He just smiled at her, a kind, reassuring smile. Have a safe trip, Triss, Apollo, or possibly Harry, said, as he started to walk away from the fire, giving her a casual, backwards wave over his shoulder. And tell Gerald that Harry sends his regards. Thank you, she called after him, and I will, she said, as she watched him walk towards the edge of the magical dome and then disappear into the swirling, white sheet of the blizzard. As she saw him disappear, it had just occurred to her, with a jolt of surprise, that the man had been wearing nothing more than a simple, thin-looking black top and some dark trousers. What's more, he hadn't even bothered to put up a shield against the biting, freezing cold when he had left the dome. Interesting. Very, very interesting indeed. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 50, Chapter 50, Silent Watcher. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. 1264. Harry's POV. Harry stood back, a silent observer on a nearby rooftop, and watched as Gerald of Rivia, a whirlwind of deadly grace, slaughtered 3 armed men and then gave chase to the cowardly, fire-slinging mage named Rents. When Harry had first talked with Ciri, all those years ago in another world, she had not liked to talk about herself much. She had always preferred to talk about the people around her instead, especially about the people she cared for so deeply. Of course, over the many months they had spent together, she had finally, gradually, given up more and more of her life story to him. Despite that, there were still things, important, crucial things, that Ciri had simply not known about in the complex, politically charged world around her. For example, she had told him that the Empire of Nilfgaard wanted her, but she hadn't, or perhaps couldn't, tell him exactly why. He had no doubt that she probably knew the reason by now, but he always got the feeling that the topic was not one she liked to dwell on, so he hadn't pressed her for details. He had no doubt, however, that she didn't know about the existence of Rents, or the shadowy figures who pulled his strings. She simply did not have the extensive, and often morally grey, spying skills that Harry had developed over the many decades, skills he had specifically honed to find out exactly what Nilfgaard was up to keep tabs on their movements and their plans. At this point, after more than a century of living, learning, and observing in this world, Harry probably knew more about it, about its history, its politics, and its magic, than Ciri herself had. He had, after all, been in this world for far longer now than he had even been in his own original world. Harry shook his head, forcefully stopping that particular train of thought. He seemed to be going off on a lot of tangents these days, his mind wandering down long, winding paths of memory and reflection. He wondered, with a flicker of wry amusement, if it was simply a natural product of his now considerable old age. He looked down from the rooftop he was casually sitting on and watched to see if Geralt would finally manage to kill the man. It certainly looked like the Witcher was giving it his all. Sadly for him, just as Geralt was closing in, a swirling, shimmering portal opened up in the air directly behind Rents, and the man, with a triumphant, sneering look on his face, was making his way towards it. Harry watched as Geralt was suddenly thrown off his feet as a powerful, concussive blast of magic exploded outwards from the portal. Harry was actually, genuinely impressed at the sheer amount of raw power behind that blast. Whoever was on the other side of that portal, Rents' mysterious master, was probably one of the most powerful mages he had ever witnessed on this world. He wondered, for a fleeting, academic moment, how that man or woman would stack up against him in a real fight. He didn't think about it for long, though, as it would seem that he now needed to intervene. He stood up and, with a casual flick of his wrist, launched a powerful, silent banishing charm at Rents. The spell caught the man mid-air as he tried to leap through the portal and back to his master. Rents went flying sideways, slamming hard into a nearby wall, while Harry, with another quick, almost contemptuous flick, cast a dispelling charm at the portal, causing it to collapse in on itself and disappear completely. At this point, Geralt had gotten back up onto his feet and was now looking at the downed, dazed Rents. He didn't even stop to think for a moment. With a guttural roar of pure fury, he charged the man, his silver sword held high. Harry's eyes widened in alarm. "No, Geralt! Wait!" Harry yelled from his rooftop perch, but it was too late. The Witcher was simply too fast, too focused on his target, to be stopped by a simple shouted warning. Geralt brought his sword down with all his might on the now terrified, helpless man's head, and cut it clean off, freezing the horrified, wide-eyed expression on the man's face for all eternity. Harry just threw his hands up in the air in sheer, utter exasperation. "Welp," he said to the empty air, "I guess we no longer have a lead on the mystery mage that was this man's benefactor, do we? No worries, I'm sure. I can just pop over to Nilfgaard and politely ask Emperor Emervar Emrace who his secretive, powerful mystery mage is." "Oh, wait a minute, no, I can't bloody do that!" Harry yelled out loud, his voice filled with frustration. Geralt sheathed his sword, the metallic rasp loud in the sudden silence, and looked up at him, his yellow eyes narrowed. "Harry? "What in the hells are you doing up there?" he asked, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "Well," Harry said, hopping down from the rooftop with a grace that defied gravity, "I was trying to capture that man alive, so I could, you know, find out who his powerful mentor was, so I could then hunt them down and kill them. But it seems that particular, rather sensible plan has now gone completely tits up, hasn't it?" Harry said, as he gave a light, irritated kick at the now beheaded, and decidedly unhelpful, Rents. "Sorry, then," Gerald grumbled, looking down darkly at the corpse. "But it was personal." Harry sighed, the frustration draining out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. It's fine, I suppose," he said, rubbing his temples. "I'll just have to find out another way to identify the mage. And besides," he added, a small, knowing smile touching his lips, "how can I possibly blame a father for protecting his little girl?" Gerald looked sharply at him at that, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. "Calm yourself, man," Harry said, raising his hands in a placating gesture before Gerald could fully draw his weapon. "I mean your daughter no harm. Quite the opposite, in fact. Now, let's go get a drink. It's been a while, and I think we should probably catch up," Harry said, as he gestured towards the main part of the town. Gerald looked at him for a long, searching second. "Fine," he finally said, his voice laced with an air of finality. "But you owe me some answers, Harry." "A lot of them." Harry nodded in agreement. As they walked, they met up with the bard Dandelion and a young, red-headed medic by the name of Shunny, who both looked rather shaken. "Dandelion, this is Harry," Gerald said, by way of introduction. "Harry, Dandelion. And this is Shunny." He gestured to them both. "Hello," Dandelion said, looking nervously at the fresh blood still spattered on Gerald's armor. Is it done, Gerald?" Gerald nodded grimly. Harry looked at Gerald's blood-soaked armor. "Here, let me get that for you," he said, and with a casual wave of his hand, all the blood and grime simply vanished from the man's armor and clothes, leaving them clean and pristine. "Thanks," Gerald said, a note of genuine appreciation in his voice. Harry just nodded. Gerald then looked back at Dandelion and Shunny. "We're going to find an inn, get some drinks, and some rest. You two coming?" I unfortunately must return to the academy," Shunny said, still looking a little pale and unwell. Harry had a feeling it had to do with the bloody aftermath of Gerald's fight she had just witnessed. "Well, I will certainly join you for a drink," Dandelion said, his usual cheerfulness returning slightly. They said their farewells to Shunny and then headed to the nearest inn to find some much-needed drink. It didn't take them long to find a suitably disreputable-looking place and get a table in a dark corner. They quickly ordered some ale. "So, tell me," Gerald started, but Harry immediately shushed him. He looked around the noisy, crowded bar, pointedly signaling to Gerald that people might be listening. He then, with a few subtle, almost invisible gestures, cast a series of powerful privacy and alarm charms around their table, ensuring that no one could listen in on their conversation, and that he would know instantly if another mage tried to dispel them. "Okay," Harry said, satisfied. "Now we can talk. Had to make sure no one could overhear our rather sensitive conversation." He took a long sip of his drink. "Fine," Gerald said, getting straight to the point, as was his way. "How do you know about Ciri?" Harry rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I was under the impression that you had read my journal, the one Yennefer had for a while." "Did you not?" Harry asked the man. "I did," Gerald confirmed. "We even tried to track you down afterwards, with no luck at all. We even went back to that cave where we first met, to try and find you, but there was no scent, no trail, nothing to follow." Harry nodded at that, then his expression turned extremely serious. "I can't tell you everything, Gerald, not yet. But I can tell you some things. But you must swear to me that you will never repeat them to a single living soul, not unless I give you my express permission. Is that clear? And you as well, Dandelion, Harry said, turning his intense, green-eyed gaze on the suddenly nervous-looking bard. Not a single word of this in any of your tales or ballads. Is that understood? Both men nodded, though Dandelion looked distinctly put out at the reprimand he had just received. Harry said, satisfied. The girl I talked about in my journal, the one I have plans for, that girl is Ciri. I have been waiting for her, watching over her from a distance, for nearly a century now. Ever since I first came to this world. Gerald's eyes squinted in suspicion, while Dandelion just looked completely, utterly shocked. Other world? Dandelion stammered. You're from another world? Harry nodded. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 51, Chapter 51, Thained. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Otherworld. Dandelion repeated, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer, unadulterated curiosity. You're really from another world? Harry nodded. I am. But I don't have the time to get into all the specific, nitty-gritty details of it right now. Ask Gerald after, if he's willing to talk about it. I still don't get it, Gerald interjected, his voice a low, skeptical rumble. If you really came from a different world, how did you even know of Ciri in the first place? And more importantly, how did you get to this world? I know about Ciri, Harry explained, his expression softening slightly at the mention of her name, because I met her before. We were good friends. Very good friends. She came to my world, for a time. I can't tell you exactly why, or how. That's her story to tell, not mine. She left after around 6 months. And I actually didn't mean to come to this world. It was pure, dumb luck, well, not really luck, I suppose, but more of a series of chaotic situations that were completely outside of my control. But when I finally realized what world I had landed in, whose world it was, I decided I would wait around for Ciri to be born, to grow up. He took a long swig of his ale, his gaze distant. Unfortunately, I can't just go up and meet her, or talk to her. Not until she meets me, originally, for the first time, in my own world. It's a temporal paradox, a very delicate one. This leaves me in an incredibly annoying, and often frustrating, predicament of trying to subtly, almost invisibly, change the world around her, to make it just a little bit more friendly, I suppose? Without, of course, really changing too much, to the point where she somehow no longer meets me in the first place. This is why I'm here now, with you. And God, he said, a genuine, weary smile finally breaking through his serious demeanor, does it feel good to finally tell someone, anyone, what the hell has been going on in my life? He took another big, long chug of his drink, as if a massive weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. I probably shouldn't have told you all of that, now that I think about it, Harry said, a moment later, as he looked at their completely, utterly stunned faces. Or, at least, at Gerald's version of a stunned face, which was mostly just a slight widening of his golden eyes and a very still expression. So, Gerald said slowly, his mind clearly working to process the insane information he'd just been given. You know Ciri, because she somehow, at some point in the future, ends up in your world for a time. Well, yes, Harry confirmed with a nod. That's the gist of it. And then, you somehow, accidentally, came to our world, but a long, long time before Ciri was even born. Gerald continued, trying to piece it all together. Right again, Harry said. And now, you can't let Ciri know you even exist, until she meets you, sometime in her future, for the very first time. Gerald asked, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. Also correct, Harry said, taking another sip of ale. Gerald grunted, just looking at him, his yellow eyes filled with a mixture of skepticism and something that looked suspiciously like belief. Dandelion, meanwhile, seemed to be doing a rather convincing fish impression, his mouth opening and closing silently. You don't believe me, do you? Harry asked Gerald directly. I do, Gerald said, surprising Harry slightly. You've never lied to me before. Though, granted, we have only met a few times. But I feel like you're leaving something important out, though. It seems to me like you're going through a whole lot of work, a whole lot of trouble, for a girl you were only with for 6 months. Gerald said, as he looked pointedly at Harry, his gaze sharp and piercing. Ciri. Harry began, his voice softening, a deep, genuine emotion entering his tone. Ciri was something special. She was not only a true friend to me, at a time when I needed one the most, but she helped me get through one of the most difficult, darkest points of my entire life. Despite not being in my life for very long, she played a significant, absolutely crucial role in helping to develop the man you see sitting before you today. Were it not for her, he paused, a shadow passing over his face. I'd rather not think about it, actually. The point is, Gerald, she was someone who I considered to be very, very important to me. I see, Gerald said, his expression unreadable. So, just friends then? Harry rolled his eyes at the man's bluntness. We were close, he said evasively. If you're asking if I was in love with her, then I honestly can't answer that. I have never truly experienced a romantic love that I could safely, definitively identify as such. So, I'm not sure if what I feel for Ciri is actually love, nor am I going to say that I plan to suddenly become her suitor or anything like that. But I can say that in the few months that I was with her, Ciri was closer to me than any other person on the planet, and I would have, without hesitation, done anything for her. He purposefully, and very wisely, left out the part where she had kissed him goodbye, because that, he knew, would have ended, well, very badly. Gerald grunted again. If I ever find out that you're taking advantage of her, Harry, dragon or not, you'll end up just like Rents. You know that, right? Harry nodded, his expression serious. I do. And it would be kind of pointless for me to do so, considering all the incredible, painstaking work I have put into making sure that she will be happy, and that she will have a long, fulfilling life. Regardless, Gerald said, his voice a low warning, the threat remains. Harry nodded again in acknowledgement. With that all cleared up, I suppose I really should be leaving now, Harry said, though he made no immediate move to get up. Where will you go now? Gerald asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Harry smiled, that enigmatic, slightly mischievous smile returning. Oh, don't you worry about that, Gerald. For now, you both look incredibly tired. Why don't you just take a little nap? Harry said, and as he spoke, he silently, with an almost imperceptible wave of his hand, cast a powerful, fast-acting sleeping charm on both of them. Gerald looked surprised for a brief moment, his witcher senses clearly trying to fight off the magical compulsion, but he had no success with it. The charm was simply too strong, too subtle. He quickly, and rather unceremoniously, slumped over on the table and didn't move. Dandelion was already snoring softly beside him. I'm sorry, Gerald, Harry said softly, looking at his sleeping friend. I trust you not to reveal my secrets, I really do. But that won't stop a powerful mage from picking through your mind and discovering it all by chance. Especially not your dear, inquisitive Yennefer. But I thank you, sincerely, for giving me someone to talk to, even for a little while. The stress recently has been quite the hindrance. He paused. Still, perhaps a small gift to apologize with. Harry took out Geralt's twin swords, the steel and the silver, from their scabbards on the Witcher's back. He gently laid them on the table and, with his eyes glowing faintly with a soft, green light, he imbued them both with a powerful, permanent sharpening and strengthening charm, a bit of his own world's magic. There, Harry said, satisfied. That should help, the next time you need an extra edge on cutting someone, or something, up. He carefully put the swords back in their sheaths and then, closing his eyes, he began the delicate, complex process of removing the recent memories of their conversation, and planting false, mundane ones in both of the men's heads. He withdrew from their minds a few moments later and looked at them both with a bit of sadness in his eyes. He took one last, long gulp of his ale and then, silently, operated away, leaving the two sleeping men to be found by the innkeeper, as he simultaneously, and from a great distance, tore down the privacy charms he had erected around their table. 1264, Thaned Island. Harry's POV. Harry flew through the air, a streak of black against the stormy night sky. He couldn't remember the last time he had flown this fast, this desperately, as a dragon, but now, he was on a strict, terrifyingly short time limit. He had just returned from Nazir, the heart of the Nilfgaardian Empire, where he had finally, after much debate with himself, decided to see if anything could be done, permanently, about the threat of Emperor Emervar Emrys. He had even, in his darker moments, seriously considered just killing the man, ending his reign of terror once and for all. However, meeting the man in person, albeit from a safe, magically concealed distance, had changed all that. Because Emervar Emrys, the ruthless, ambitious emperor of Nilfgaard, was also Duny, the urchin of Erlenwald, Ciri's biological father. Harry still did not know how the man had managed to live through that terrible storm at sea all those years ago, the one that had supposedly claimed the lives of both him and Princess Pavita. Even Harry, who had been following them at the time, trying to find a way to possibly do something to help them, had been forced to leave, to retreat, when the storm had hit. Even in his immensely powerful dragon form, he could not stop the sheer, raw forces of nature from tossing him around like a child's forgotten doll. But it mattered little how the man had survived. All that mattered now was that the sick fuck, Ciri's own father, wanted to marry her, to use her to legitimize his claim to the Cintran throne, and he had a powerful, ruthless, and incredibly ambitious sorcerer named Vilgefortz of Rogveen in charge of getting her for him. And this Vilgefortz character, Harry had learned, was planning to take out the entire chapter of sorcerers of the Northern Kingdoms, in one single, bloody night, during a little get-together they were having, a grand conclave. A get-together that he happened to know, with a cold, sinking dread, that Yennefer, Geralt, and, most importantly, Ciri, were currently attending. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 52, Chapter 52, Shattered Timelines. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Harry had been so stupid. So incredibly, monumentally stupid. How could he have possibly forgotten about the goddamn Thaned coup? Normally, he wouldn't have been too worried about it. He knew the general outcome, that it was an expected event in the timeline, and he knew that no one who truly mattered to him died or got too badly banged up during the initial chaos. At least, not permanently. Unfortunately, he had also recently found out that the fire-happy, cowardly mage named Rence was, in fact, Vilgefortz's apprentice. With Rents now dead, prematurely removed from the board by Geralt's sword, there was simply no way to tell how Vilgefortz, that master manipulator, would react without the aid of his key assistant. Of course, everything could still work out fine, the timeline could correct itself, but Harry wasn't willing to test fate, not when Ciri's safety was on the line. Harry didn't have to fly long before he picked up a familiar, comforting scent on the wind, the scent of Geralt, a man he had just left a few weeks previous. He tilted his massive dragon head down and saw a tall, slender, grey tower standing near a winding road toward Lara. With his superior, draconic eyesight, he could clearly see two forms that seemed to be clashing at its base. He quickly realized this was Geralt, fighting for his life, and he swooped down without a second thought. He shifted from his colossal dragon form back to his much smaller, more maneuverable human one mid-air, and quickly descended through the stormy sky. As he got closer to the ground, he cast a silent featherweight charm on himself, causing him to drift lightly, almost weightlessly, towards the ground. He landed without even a single thump and looked around, taking in the scene. About 100 yards away, the powerful mage, Vilgefortz, had Geralt on the ground, his magical staff glowing with a malevolent, threatening light. What was worse, Harry could feel Ciri's frantic, chaotic magic pulsing from within that very tower. If Harry remembered correctly from her stories, she would soon go through the unstable portal at the top of the tower and end up stranded in the blistering Korath desert. He hoped, with a desperate intensity, that she would still remain relatively okay, as she had in the original timeline. Right now, though, he had to worry about Geralt. Harry whipped out the Elder Wand, its familiar, powerful weight a comfort in his hand. He had a strong feeling he would need its full, unrivaled power for this particular battle. He ran, a blur of motion, quickly towards the two men. "Conf Rigo Maxima!" Harry yelled, and watched as a large, crackling blue wave of explosive energy shot from his wand and hurtled towards Vilgefortz. The powerful sorcerer, however, swiftly turned and, with a casual, almost contemptuous swipe of his staff, batted the curse aside, blasting it apart before it even reached him. Vilgefortz said, a small, arrogant smile playing on his lips as he turned his full attention to Harry. Well, what do we have here? A new player. A mage with quite a bit of raw power to him, it seems. Though, I don't believe we have had the pleasure of meeting before. Harry sneered. He had to be careful here. In combat, his own personal specialty had always been taking out large groups of people or powerful, single mages with overwhelming, almost uncontrollable spells that were nearly impossible to counter. That's why Fiend Fire, in all its destructive glory, had always been a personal favorite of his. Most people, besides himself, simply couldn't counter it. Sadly, he could use none of his usual, overwhelming, area of effect spells right now, not with Geralt currently passed out, vulnerable and helpless, so close by. Don't worry, Harry said, his voice a low, menacing growl. We won't be acquainted for very long. I guarantee it. He then jumped into action. Locomotor Mortis. Vox Inrita. Petrificus Totalis. Expulso. Harry said, launching a rapid, relentless chain of spells at the man. Vilgefortz just twirled his staff with clear, arrogant expertise, swatting the various spells out of the air as if they were nothing more than bothersome flies. Harry smirked. He had expected the man to do just that, which was precisely why the last spell in the chain had been an expulso charm. As Vilgefortz's staff hit that particular spell, it exploded in a massive, fiery ball of flames, completely engulfing the man. Unfortunately, Vilgefortz called out something ineligible in Elder speech, and the flames simply winked out of existence, though Vilgefortz did look considerably more annoyed now. You will regret that, Vilgefortz spat out at him, his composure finally cracking. Probably not, to be honest, Harry shot back, as he deftly dodged a searing arc of crackling lightning that sailed right past him, scorching the ground where he had just been standing. "Maybe you should stick to your little stick fighting, mate," Harry taunted the man. That seemed to make Vilgefortz even angrier. He chanted something else, a longer, more complex incantation in elder speech, and suddenly, a swirling, black portal ripped open the air beside him. Harry tensed, thinking the man was calling for reinforcements. He was only partially correct. A giant, hulking stone golem emerged from the portal, its magical runes glowing with a sickly green light. Harry had seen a few golems since arriving in this world, but he had never, ever seen one that was this big before. "Oh, cock," Harry said to himself, as the large, lumbering stone creature began to shamble towards him. Now, Vilgefortz was pushing on the offensive. Harry now had to deal with both a powerful, close-range attacker and a dangerous, long-range one, simultaneously. "Bombardo!" Harry yelled, and watched as the explosive spell smashed into the stone creature. The golem took some visible damage, a large chunk of its stone chest exploding outwards, but it was still on its feet, still trying to kill him. Luckily, however, Harry could now use the big, walking stone slab as a convenient, mobile shield from Vilgefortz's ongoing magical onslaught, as it was now positioned directly between the two of them. Harry thought for a quick minute on how to best, and most quickly, dispatch the golem, when his eyes traced the glowing, intricate runes etched all over its body, and a sudden, brilliant idea, came to him. "Omnia Perturber," Harry said, a new, complex incantation on his lips. A sickly green spell erupted from his wand and smashed directly into the golem. The effect was almost immediate. The golem seemed to take no further physical damage, but the glowing green runic arrays all over its body began to flicker erratically, until, one by one, they went out completely. The golem went out with them, as it no longer had the magic holding its disparate parts together, and it simply, silently, crumbled into a large, inert pile of rubble on the ground. "Impressive," Vilgefortz commented, that arrogant smile returning to his face, though his eyes were wary. "I aim to please," Harry replied, as he immediately jumped back into action, pressing his advantage. "Flammes Acrobus," he shot out as he moved forward, rushing the man. The vicious, magical fire did not hit Vilgefortz directly, but the ground right next to his feet. Vilgefortz, instinctively, tried to put out the extremely hot, clinging fire quickly, which was the exact opening Harry had been waiting for. "Maledictus glacis," Harry said, his voice sharp. A brilliant, crystal blue spell shot out of his wand and hit Vilgefortz's outstretched arm while he was distracted with the fire. Vilgefortz screamed, a raw, agonized sound, and for very good reason. Harry had just hit him with the spell of cursed ice, a particularly nasty piece of dark magic he'd created himself. It was a spell known to instantly encase its victims in a thick, rapidly spreading layer of magical ice, an ice that was held together with dark, corrosive magic, making it incredibly hard to combat on a normal day. If it hit you, you were most likely dead from frostbite and organ failure within 30 seconds. Which was why Harry was so incredibly surprised when Vilgefortz wasn't. The man seemed to recognize, almost immediately, what the spell was doing, despite the fact that he had certainly never seen it before. Not knowing how to stop the cursed spell that was already creeping rapidly up his arm, threatening to encase his whole body, he simply severed his own arm, completely, with a single, sharp severing spell. Harry almost grimaced at the sight, yet he couldn't help but be impressed with the man's ruthless, quick thinking. Vilgefortz, now missing an entire arm, fell down to one knee, his face pale and twisted with pain. "It looks like this was my win," Harry taunted the man, his voice cold. "A shame, really, that we both couldn't go all out. I should have very much liked to know what some of your more destructive spells were capable of. Too bad you couldn't afford to accidentally destroy that pretty little tower of yours, with its precious cargo inside." No matter what, Vilgefortz had lost a great deal today with the loss of his arm. He would not be able to grow another one, not a functional one, not even with Harry's own terrific healing skills. The loss of his arm would also give him a major, permanent hit to his spell repertoire, since so many powerful spells, especially in this world, required two hands to perform properly. Not that any of that really mattered in the long run. Harry wasn't about to let him walk away from today. Ciri had told him, in her nightmares, that this man would one day brutally torture Yennefer for information about her. And Harry simply would not allow that to ever happen. Vilgefortz looked up at him, a strange, triumphant smile suddenly on his pain-twisted face. "You think you have won, stranger," he gasped, his voice strained. "I may be disarmed, quite literally, but I am not so stupid as to believe myself infallible. I always plan for everything," Vilgefortz said with a knowing, chilling smirk as he looked at him. Harry looked at the man closely, a sudden sense of confusion and alarm washing over him, ready for any of his tricks. It took him only a moment to realize that Vilgefortz was not looking directly at him, but behind him? "Oh, shite!" Harry thought, as he made to turn around, but he was too late. The next thing he knew, something incredibly hard and heavy hit him squarely on the back of the head, hard. His world immediately, without another thought, delved into an inky, silent blackness. "Take him to the hidden laboratory at Stiga Castle." Vilgefortz's strained, but triumphant, voice was the last thing Harry heard. "I am most curious to find out this man's secrets. Before he dies, that is. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 53, Prisoner. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Harry woke up groggily, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from the back of his skull. He blinked a few times, his vision swimming, before his eyes were finally able to focus on the room around him. He seemed to be in some sort of lab. A dungeon laboratory, to be more precise. He had seen a few labs that the sorcerers of this world used before, during his long years of research, but not this particular one. It looked like it was located deep underground, or possibly in some ancient, forgotten catacombs. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone in some places, but he could also see large areas where it was just packed, damp dirt. Judging by the musty, underground smell, a scent he knew all too well, he was somewhere very, very deep. Across the dimly lit laboratory, he could see a small, narrow staircase that led up to a heavy, iron-banded wooden door, which seemed to be the only visible exit. He looked down at his own body and saw that he was covered in thick, heavy chains. They looked to be made of silver, but with a slight, dull bronze tint to them. They were wrapped tightly around all his limbs, his ankles, his wrists, and his torso, with his arms being held up and chained securely to the cold stone wall behind him. Harry growled softly, a low, dangerous sound in his throat, upon seeing the dimeridium chains shackling his body. Vilgefortz, that arrogant bastard, seemed to have gone completely over the top to make sure he didn't escape. And, Harry had to admit, he had done a damn good job of it. Harry knew, from his own extensive, and often painful, experimentation over the years, that dimeridium, in large enough quantities, could suppress his magic enough to stop him from turning into a dragon. He had always dismissed the possibility of it being used against him, though, as he had doubted any sorcerer would ever think to use so much of the rare, expensive metal. Vilgefortz must have been thoroughly convinced by the sheer, overwhelming power Harry had shown him in their brief, but intense, battle. Harry cursed himself for letting his own arrogance, his own overconfidence, blind him enough to let his guard down, to allow someone to sneak up on him like that. It's not like he ever truly thought Vilgefortz could actually kill him, but Harry knew better than anyone that there were things out there, things that could be done to a person, that were far, far worse than a simple, clean death. He heard a metallic clank, and he looked towards the wooden door to see the man of the hour, Vilgefortz himself, enter the lab. Harry stopped himself from smirking when he could see that Vilgefortz was, indeed, still missing an arm from their battle, the stump of his shoulder crudely bandaged. "How are you liking your new accommodations?" Vilgefortz asked, a smug, self-satisfied smile on his face, a smile that Harry would have almost mistaken as pleasant if he were a lesser, more naive man. Harry said nothing, refusing to rise to the man's obvious bait. He simply stayed silent, his green eyes cold and watchful as he looked over the man. "You would never believe that it's already been 7 whole months since we last fought, would you?" Vilgefortz said, his voice conversational. That did catch Harry's attention. 7 months? How in the bloody hells had it already been 7 months? "I can see the shock in your eyes, even if your face doesn't show it," Vilgefortz continued, clearly enjoying himself. "It was quite a strange, and frustrating, experience, I must admit. I tried very, very hard to kill you, you see. Yet nothing I did seemed to work. At first, I tried to suck your life force out, to drain your magic and use it to empower myself, but after weeks and weeks of struggling, I simply could not force it to leave your body. It was as if it were anchored to you, on a fundamental level. Then, in a fit of pure anger and frustration, I tried to cut off your head, only for it to simply reattach itself, before my blade had even fully gone through your neck. Over and over and over again, I tried, yet nothing seemed to work. It was then, after much experimentation, that I finally concluded that you had, indeed, somehow learned the secrets of true immortality. And I think," he said, his eyes gleaming with a mad, obsessive light, "that you can probably see where I am going with this, can't you?" Vilgefortz asked the question, but Harry heard him only distantly. He could only think, with a cold, chilling resolve, about how he was now going to have to make absolutely, positively sure that he killed this man, slowly and painfully, when he finally got free. "I suppose," Harry said, his voice a low, dangerous drawl, "that this is the part where you ask me how to gain such a remarkable ability for yourself." He looked at the man with a cool, detached amusement. "And I suppose," Vilgefortz countered, his smile widening, "that your amused, and rather condescending, response means that you won't be telling me willingly. Which, I'm sure you already know, means that I will simply have to find out the fun way." Vilgefortz stepped back from Harry and then walked over to a nearby, cluttered workbench. He picked up a long, rolled-up leather cloth and brought it over to him. He unrolled it with a flourish, revealing a multitude of sharp, gleaming, and rather nasty-looking surgical and torturer's instruments. As a master healer, Harry knew the intended use of almost every single one of them. He raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You really think you're actually going to find something, don't you?" Harry told him, his voice laced with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You're a complete and utter fool if you didn't think I had made absolutely certain, long, long ago, that no one would ever be able to find out my secrets through such crude methods." Before Vilgefortz could even begin, Harry zoned out. He knew, from long, painful experience, how to deal with torture. With his complete and utter mastery of occlumency, he was able to retreat deep, deep into the fortified labyrinth of his own mind, and pretty much ignore any physical damage his body sustained. He could still feel it, on some distant, detached level, but he could definitely, and much more easily, ignore it. It wasn't long before he felt the cold, heavy dimeridium chains on his body moving. Vilgefortz seemed to be smart enough to know not to take any of the magical suppressing chains off completely. He did, however, shift the ones on his torso, exposing his chest. A moment later, Harry felt something sharp, cold, and precise go through his skin. Vilgefortz had just stabbed into him with a scalpel and was now trying to cut open his chest cavity, to get at the organs within. His body, as it always did, naturally began to heal itself. But anything that wasn't immediately life-threatening, like getting stabbed directly in the heart or getting his head completely chopped off, would take longer to regenerate. It was, Harry noted with a detached, clinical annoyance, quite convenient for Vilgefortz's little experiment. Not even a peep, Vilgefortz said, a note of genuine, impressed surprise in his voice. Your mental fortitude is even more impressive than I thought it would be. Harry said nothing in response, just remained silent, deep within his own mind. He knew that any reaction, any sound, would just encourage the man. He wasn't sure, but through the hazy, detached fog of his occlumency, he thought he saw a gleam of what seemed like pure, unadulterated insanity in Vilgefortz's eyes as he cut into him again. Vilgefortz waited for him to heal, then repeated the act, over and over and over again. There was probably enough of Harry's blood on the cold, stone floor now to create and fill a small swimming pool. And through it all, Harry had continued to say absolutely nothing. He could feel his pain receptors, on some distant, biological level, screaming at his brain, telling him that he was in immense, agonizing pain, but he simply, coolly, ignored it, and pressed on, his mind a fortress of calm. Vilgefortz said out loud, his voice filled with a mad, scientific curiosity. It would seem that the cuts always heal, but the deadlier, the more life-threatening the wound is, the more quickly it heals. How absolutely fascinating! How does the body know what to prioritize? Further research is most definitely needed. Vilgefortz said this out loud, as if dictating notes, as he started writing in a small, leather-bound journal of some kind. He continued his little experiment for what felt like hours, or perhaps even days, before finally, with a sigh of what sounded like contentment, stopping. Well, Vilgefortz said, wiping his bloody hands on a rag, I think that's enough, progress, for today. We shall continue on the morrow. See you then, my little immortal prisoner. Vilgefortz said with a wide, triumphant grin, before sweeping dramatically out of the room. As soon as the heavy wooden door closed behind him with a loud, echoing thud, all the torches and candles in the room were instantly snuffed out, plunging Harry into complete and utter darkness. Harry frowned as his eyes, even with their enhanced abilities, struggled to get used to the complete, suffocating lack of light. Well, Harry, he thought to himself, a grim, determined sense of resolve beginning to form in the quiet, dark fortress of his mind. How in the bloody hells are you going to get yourself out of this one? If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 54, Chapter 54, Shattered Chains. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. As it turned out, Harry couldn't get himself out of his current situation. Not easily, at least. Vilgefortz, the arrogant bastard, was much more careful and meticulous than he had initially predicted. The sorcerer constantly made sure to have Harry checked in on, day and night, and he seemed to be completely immune to any and all bait Harry threw at him in order to get him to slip up, to make a mistake. Harry had no idea how long he had been chained up in this damp, dark prison, but he knew, with a growing sense of dread, that it must have been a very, very long time. It had taken a while, but enough verbal slips and careless comments from Vilgefortz had given him the distinct impression that he was being held deep underground, in some sort of catacombs beneath a large castle. One day, he had also found out, much to his dismay, that he was not the only prisoner in said castle, though he was clearly the most hidden and most important one. He had heard a woman, distantly, screaming in agony, her voice muffled by thick stone and earth. The screams were most likely the result of torture. Vilgefortz had even mentioned her once, a passing, contemptuous comment about how he had caught a little raven and was currently trying to get it to speak on certain important matters. Harry had said nothing in response, and the man hadn't seemed to be waiting for one either. Vilgefortz had just pulled out his wicked-looking tools before continuing on with his sick, twisted little experiments on Harry's immortal body. That's what Harry's life was like now, for longer than he could possibly keep count. He couldn't even accurately say how much time had passed, and it was starting to genuinely concern him. Sorcerers, he knew, lived for a very long time compared to normal humans, and he only had a couple of precious years left until the timeline dictated that he would finally, properly, meet Ciri. He didn't know how long he had already been down here, but he knew he needed to really start thinking of a way to get out of here. And soon. The heavy dimeridium chains made it incredibly difficult, for sure. If only there wasn't so damn many of them. His first thought, his first desperate attempt, had been to try and continuously, relentlessly, rip the chains directly out of the stone wall, to free his hands and arms through sheer, brute force. Sadly, that had not worked. He had tried for what he assumed had been weeks, pulling and straining until his muscles burned and his regenerating flesh tore, with not even a single, satisfying loosening of the bolts. His next desperate idea had been to somehow, through sheer willpower, overpower his magical restraints, to force his magic through the dampening effect of the dimeridium. That hadn't worked either. Harry was just starting to think of what his next, increasingly desperate attempt could possibly be, before Vilgefortz suddenly, unexpectedly, entered the room. And for once, the powerful sorcerer didn't look to be smiling his usual smug, arrogant smile. Instead, he seemed to be scowling deeply as he rushed around the lab, but he had yet to approach, or even look directly at Harry. He watched as Vilgefortz started frantically burning papers and research notes, notes that Harry knew had, at least partially, been about him, about his own unique biology and immortality. He then rushed back towards the heavy wooden door, where he finally looked back at Harry, his scowl deepening into a hateful glare. Harry just raised a single, questioning eyebrow in response, before Vilgefortz slammed the door completely shut and, Harry assumed, locked it. After he did so, the door glowed with a sickly, translucent green light for a moment before disappearing from view, replaced by a solid, seamless stone wall. Harry assumed it was some sort of powerful, permanent protection charm placed on the door, a final fuck you from the sorcerer. That, combined with the fact that the man had just burned many precious hours of his own meticulous research, led Harry to the logical conclusion that someone, or something, was here in the castle, something that Vilgefortz wanted to make absolutely sure wouldn't find his notes, no matter what. It didn't take long for his suspicions to be confirmed, as he soon heard the faint, distant sounds of very intense fighting going on, far above him. They must have been here for one of the other prisoners, or perhaps just to kill the sick fuck, Vilgefortz. He almost felt conflicted. On the one hand, if they killed Vilgefortz, then there was a much greater chance of him eventually getting out of here. But if they killed him, then Harry wouldn't be able to do it himself, slowly and painfully. What a weird, frustrating position for him to be in. The sounds of fighting lasted for a good, long while before finally, eventually, stopping. He waited, straining his ears, trying to hear if anyone would come down near his hidden cell. He knew Vilgefortz had probably made sure that no one outside this room would be able to hear him, so he didn't even bother yelling to try and get their attention. He just waited, and hoped, that they would somehow come and investigate. After waiting for what felt like hours, he was forced to conclude that either Vilgefortz had been triumphant, or the intruders had simply gotten what they came for and had not bothered to investigate the deeper, hidden parts of the dungeons where he was being held. It was also entirely possible, and highly likely, that Vilgefortz had magically hidden any entrance that could possibly lead to this room. That's certainly what Harry would have done, if he were being honest. After what felt like several more long, silent days, Harry finally concluded that Vilgefortz must have been killed. He only had one arm, after all, thanks to Harry, which was an extremely bad handicap for a sorcerer of his caliber, no matter how powerful he was. Concluding this, he once again, with renewed determination, tried to escape his confines. He tried for what he assumed was days and days, pulling and straining, before finally, with a roar of pure frustration, giving up. He bowed his head, defeated, his messy black hair falling over his face. He could not afford to just wait for someone to come and rescue him. He needed to escape, and he needed to escape now. Harry was so deep in his frustrated, desperate thoughts that he almost didn't notice the strange, new sensation, the feeling of magic, immense and powerful, slowly gathering near him. Almost. He turned his head up towards the stone roof of his cell and vaguely felt a massive concentration of magical energy gathering high above his head. He wondered, for a brief, hopeful moment, if a particularly powerful mage had finally come to investigate, only for the raw, palpable power to just keep on increasing and increasing and increasing. His eyes started to widen as he felt the sheer, overwhelming scale of the magical build-up. Even with his own magic almost completely suppressed by the dimeridium, there was no way he would not be able to notice this. He kept feeling it, this immense, growing power. Whoever was doing this, whoever was gathering this much energy, would have to be, at the very least, his equal in raw magical power. Just as he felt the power hit a critical, almost unbearable boiling point, he felt it suddenly stop, and then come crashing down, all at once. First, there was a deafening, unnatural silence. Then, the noise came, like 1,000 simultaneous roars, a sound so loud it felt like it was tearing the very air apart. Finally, the shaking started. Harry had been alive for a long, long time, but he had never, ever felt the very earth move and shake as much as it was doing right now. The room itself, his prison, was collapsing all around him, and for the first time in a very, very long time, he felt a genuine flicker of fear, a terrifying premonition that he was about to spend the rest of his immortal, unending life buried deep, deep in the cold, dark ground. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the violent shaking stopped, though it wasn't much of a help at this point. Harry was now buried completely, crushed under tons and tons of rock and earth. He could barely move, as most of his body had been completely, brutally crushed by the collapsing ceiling, and he knew he would now need to wait, patiently, for it all to heal. While his immortal body began its slow, painstaking work of regeneration, Harry just laid his head down to rest. It was so quiet now, yet also, peaceful, in a strange, surreal way. He could feel, with his now returning magical senses, the many life forms still moving around the ruined castle far above him, could feel them moving about in a state of sheer panic from the massive, catastrophic magical blast that had just been set off. He could even feel 3 powerful sorceresses, far in the distance, as they opened their portals to leave. At least that answered the question of what had caused the magical blast. It had to have been Yennefer, and her companions. He could feel, wait. How could he feel all of that? His magical senses were supposed to be completely, utterly dampened by the... Harry looked down at his own, crushed and broken body. The heavy, oppressive dimeridium chains that had been holding him captive for so long, they were mostly broken, shattered and scattered around his body by the force of the collapse. Most of the remaining links only laid loosely on him now, their magical suppressing properties severely diminished. He was free. He was finally free. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 55, Chapter 55, Hunger. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. A smirk, a grim, determined expression on his face. Harry staggered into a crowded, smoky inn quite loudly, his movements still a little stiff and uncoordinated. He didn't quite know where he was, only that it was somewhere in the south, somewhere warm. All he truly knew, with a deep, primal certainty, was that he was absolutely, ravenously, starving. He plopped down heavily on a rough-hewn bench and waited for the serving wench to come take his order, which, seeing his ragged state, didn't take long at all. "What can I get for you, lad?" she asked, her voice surprisingly kind. "Everything," Harry said, his voice a low, raspy growl. "And make it quick, too." He plopped down a heavy, clinking bag of coin he had acquired, onto the table. It was heavy with coin, more than enough to buy the entire inn stock for a week. The wench's eyes widened at the sound and weight of it, before she bowed her head in understanding and quickly scurried away to the kitchens. Soon, Harry was devouring an entire table's worth of food all by himself, with no clear signs of stopping. Just because hunger could not technically kill him didn't mean it wasn't an incredibly unpleasant, all-consuming sensation, one he wished to avoid at all costs. He noticed, vaguely, that almost everyone else in the inn was now looking at him, their expressions a mixture of horror, fascination, and perhaps a little bit of awe, at how much food one man could possibly consume. He couldn't bring himself to care about the attention he was getting, though. He was just so hungry. The wench kept bringing him more and more food: roasted chickens, loaves of bread, entire wheels of cheese, pitchers of ale, and eventually, after what felt like an eternity of blissful, uninterrupted eating, he was finally full enough to think about something besides the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. He began to eat slower now, his mind finally clear enough to think, to plan his next move. The very first thing he had done when he had finally, painstakingly, clawed his way out of the tons of rubble at Stega Castle was to figure out exactly how long he had been imprisoned there. He was immensely relieved to find that it wasn't quite as long as he had initially feared, only a little over 2 years. The next thing he did was figure out exactly what had happened at Stega Castle, which he had finally learned the name of. He had done this by summoning the ghostly spirit of Vilgi Forts, which also, quite satisfyingly, confirmed that the man was well and truly dead. Harry had then, rather gleefully, made the spirit recount the tale of its own painful, humiliating death over and over and over again, before finally, reluctantly, allowing it back into the shadowy land of the dead. That was really the only true revenge he could get on the man now that he was no longer in the realm of the living, which, to be honest, frustrated Harry immensely. Vilgi Fort's death had been far too quick, too easy. He had wanted to fight him again, to tear him apart between his own dragon claws, slowly, before roasting him alive. Sadly, it seemed that Gerald had beaten him to the punch. The next thing on his agenda would be planning how, exactly, he was going to kill Emperor Emervar Emrace, for unknowingly, but directly, causing him this significant, infuriating setback. If that incestuous asshole wasn't so damn focused on fucking his own daughter, then none of this would have ever happened. But first, he would need to talk to Gerald. Sadly, he knew that Ciri was most likely with him and Yennefer at the moment, which meant that he would need to find a way to get the Witcher alone. He also had the problem of finding him in the first place, but he knew they would most likely be back in the northern kingdoms by now, probably somewhere in Temeria or Redania. He finally finished the last of the giant pile of food that the inn's cook had made for him and laid down a few more gold coins for the hard-working wench to take. He was pretty sure he had just given them the equivalent of a month's worth of food pay, but he didn't really care. It was the first proper meal he had eaten in who knows how long. He was still being looked at, stared at, by the other patrons of this fine establishment. They were all, he noted, subjects of the vast Nilfgaardian Empire, as he was still deep in the province of Ebbing, so they seemed to dress a little nicer, a little more uniformly, than the rougher peasants of the northern kingdoms. Not much of a surprise there. He stood up from his table and walked out of the inn, feeling a lot more satisfied, and a lot less homicidal, than when he had come in. Now, all that was left to do was to go and vent some of the remaining steam. He had seen a small, isolated Nilfgaardian military outpost on his way to this town, one that looked ripe for a bit of burning. He supposed he could go there next. A little bit of destructive stress relief was long overdue. Harry stood outside the city of Rivia, hidden in a small, dense forest, as he watched his favorite witcher, Gerald, as he expertly tracked something through the woods. The tracks, of course, were fake. Harry had carefully, and very convincingly, planted them himself, just to lure Gerald away from any prying eyes and ears. Gerald, he knew, thought he was tracking a particularly large and dangerous basilisk. When Gerald had finally gotten deep enough into the forest, far from any roads or settlements, Harry approached him. "Hello, Gerald," Harry said, as he appeared, silently, a few yards behind the man. "It's been a while." Gerald spun around smoothly, his hand already on the hilt of his sword, but he didn't seem too surprised to see Harry. "And where the hell have you been?" he questioned, in his usual gruff, no-nonsense manner. "I haven't seen you since that chaotic night on Thamed." Harry frowned slightly at the unpleasant memories of that night. "I didn't know you were awake when I had arrived, but yes, it has been a while." "That night," he began, his voice turning grim, "I was captured by Volgi forts. Or at least, by an accomplice of his. I had foolishly, arrogantly, believed that I had won our little duel, that I had him right where I wanted him, only to completely ignore the accomplice sneaking up behind me and knocking me out cold. Quite the embarrassing blunder, to be completely honest." Gerald was silent at this admittance, but Harry had a feeling he was surprised by the information. "I was then put into heavy chains of dimeridium," Harry continued, "and left in a dark, forgotten cell deep under Stiga Castle, where I stayed until it was, rather conveniently for me, destroyed by a powerful, catastrophic magical blast." "Wait," Gerald said, his eyes widening slightly. "So, you were there, when you and Yennefer stormed the place?" "Yes, I was," Harry confirmed. "I had hoped you might find me, but it seemed it was not to be." Gerald looked slightly, and uncharacteristically, apologetic at that. "I'm sorry, Harry. Had I known you were there—" "It's fine," Harry interrupted him. "I don't blame you, and in hindsight, it was actually better that you left me there. It would have brought a certain kind of unwanted attention on me that I didn't particularly want at the time. But enough about all that. I have come to ask you what has happened while I have been gone. As well as what happened after your rather eventful siege on the castle." With that, they both sat down on a fallen log, across from each other, as Gerald began his long, detailed tale of everything that Harry had missed. Harry listened raptly to every word, but by the end of it, he ended up breathing a quiet sigh of relief. So far, the major events of the timeline didn't seem to be too different from what he knew was supposed to happen, which was good. With Ciri leaving this world soon, as he knew she would, he could finally stop messing around in the shadows and start taking a much more active role in shaping this world's future. Harry mused, once Gerald had finished. "You mentioned the Emperor, Emmer. What was your, and your companions', opinion of him at the time?" Gerald looked at him for a long, thoughtful moment before continuing on. "The man was a very serious type," he said, his voice a low grumble. "He definitely had a strategic mind, you could see that. And he had a strange, almost cold, notion of mercy, though it was still, I suppose, better than some of the other, more barbaric rulers I have seen." Harry nodded. He knew that Ciri never cared much for her biological father, and he just needed to confirm that Gerald didn't have any particular loyalty to the man either. "I see," Harry said. "Gerald, this may seem like an odd, and perhaps even a loaded question, but what do you truly think of the northern kingdoms, and their various rulers? Do you like the way they're run? Or do you think they would, perhaps, benefit from a more unified, orderly, Nilfgaardian rule? Gerald looked at him suspiciously, his yellow eyes narrowing. Harry, Gerald said, his voice a low, warning tone. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 56, Chapter 56, Frozen Expanse. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Harry, Gerald said again, his voice still a low, warning rumble. Harry brushed it aside with an impatient wave of his hand. Don't get it in your head that I suddenly like Nilfgaardians or would ever, under any circumstances, help their rule, Harry said, trying to pacify the clearly suspicious Witcher. I'm just asking a simple, hypothetical question, is all. Indulge me. Gerald stopped and seemed to think on it for a moment, his golden eyes narrowed in thought before he finally answered. I don't particularly like Nilfgaardians, that's true, he admitted, his voice a low grumble. But I can't honestly say I like many of the so-called nobles of the northern kingdoms either. Most of them are either complete, utter idiots, or they're insatiably power-hungry. Sometimes, they're both. Would the common people, in the long run, actually benefit from a unified, orderly Nilfgaardian rule? Eventually, probably. Once they learn to accept it. But there would be a lot of fighting, a lot of bloodshed, before that ever happened, even if Nilfgaard does manage to completely overthrow the northern kings. Harry nodded slowly, taking in Gerald's surprisingly pragmatic assessment. I agree, he said. Though Nilfgaard, of course, has its own, rather significant problems, I suppose. It's too bad, really, that there is no such thing as a truly perfect government. Well, he said, his tone shifting, becoming more final, that is all I really wanted to ask you, Gerald. And I probably won't be seeing you for some time after this. Probably years, if I'm being completely honest. Gerald raised a single, questioning eyebrow. Going somewhere? Yes, Harry confirmed. For now, I am going to the far north. I have some rather ambitious plans I need to put into action. The far north? Gerald repeated, a hint of surprise in his voice. There's not much out there except untamed, frozen wilderness and wild, dangerous beasts. Not many people live out there either, except for a few hardy hunters and the occasional, reclusive craftsman. It's too damn cold for anyone else to really live there for long. Harry rolled his eyes. I'm aware of what the far north is, thank you, Gerald, he said dryly. But I would still like you to visit, if you ever get the chance, though, Harry told the man, his voice softening, becoming kind once more. And you expect me to just be able to find you, in the vast, uncharted wilderness of the far north? Gerald pointed out, a hint of a smirk on his lips. I can't even seem to find you when you're in a settled, civilized kingdom. Harry rolled his eyes again before reaching into his pocket and pulling out what looked like a simple, unassuming wooden bracelet. Here, he said. Tap the small, silver rune that's carved into the wood piece, and then just say my name. It will help guide you to me, if you ever truly need to find me. And don't let anyone else take it, or they may not have a hand for very long. Harry said, as he dropped the simple, yet clearly magical, item into Gerald's outstretched hand. Gerald turned the bracelet around in his hand for a moment, examining the intricate, unfamiliar rune, before slipping it onto his wrist. I appreciate the gesture, Gerald said, his voice sincere as he looked at the unexpected gift. Harry just nodded. Well, he said, I must be off, There is plenty to do, and very little time to do it in. And with a final, small smile, he operated away from the Witcher, leaving Geralt just standing there, in the quiet, peaceful forest, watching in that same, familiar amazement as Harry left him once again. Harry stood atop the highest peak of the Dragon Mountains, the biting, frigid wind whipping at his clothes, as he stared out into the vast, untamed wilderness of what was known as the Far North. He had been into its icy depths only twice before in his long time on this world, and both of those times had been purely out of a sense of academic curiosity. It was a harsh, unforgiving place to live, and that was mainly because of the relentless, bone-chilling cold. It snowed here all year round, and it had much smaller, more scattered populations of both animals and people. Even most monsters, it seemed, refused to live up here in such harsh, inhospitable conditions, preferring to live further south, where it was warmer and prey was more abundant. There were a few things that did live out here, though. White dragons, for instance, were the most famous, and most feared, of the Far North's inhabitants. Many in the south thought of them as just a rare, exotic subspecies of common dragons, a myth even, yet Harry knew the truth. There were more white dragons living, hidden and thriving, past these mountains than there were regular dragons in all of the northern kingdoms combined. Especially since no one was foolish enough, or skilled enough, to come up here to hunt them. Sure, they had started out with an extremely small, almost critically endangered population centuries ago, but now, there were probably close to 50 of them that called the vast, frozen expanse of the Far North their home. Harry inhaled deeply, the freezing air burning his lungs, before exhaling a thick cloud of white steam into the air as his hot breath met the cold. This would be his new home, for a good long while. Ciri was probably leaving this world any week now, as her destiny dictated, and he had no idea when, or even if, she would ever return. What he did know, with an absolute, unshakable certainty, was that when she did return, she was going to need allies. Powerful, loyal allies. He had tried to do it all himself, to protect her from the shadows, but he had discovered, the hard way, that even he could not be everywhere at once. He needed backup, a force to be reckoned with, to not only protect Ciri from the relentless pursuit of the Wild Hunt, but also from the many greedy, ambitious empires of the continent who desired her for her power, as well as the many other shadowy figures who wished to gain their own power through her unique, potent elder blood. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 57, Chapter 57, Convergence. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. With that in mind, it was time to get her some allies. And here, in this harsh, untamed land, would be his starting ground. He would start a new kingdom here, a kingdom of his own, and he would use it to strike down all the others who dared to try and harm Ciri. He would also use it to keep her creep of a father, Emperor Emmer, far, far away from her. He couldn't just kill him, sadly, not without causing Ciri unimaginable pain, as he was, after all, still her father. But he could go against him in other, more, creative ways. Such as challenging, and eventually dismantling, the precious empire that he thought was so damn impressive. Harry stopped his thoughts on his further, long-term plans, and instead focused in on his more immediate, current goals. While he could just go around, magically forcing people and creatures under his rule, that would just make him a tyrant, another power-hungry conqueror, and that's not a label he ever wished upon himself again. No, he needed to convince people that he had a right to rule, to lead. He needed to show them something beyond just sweet-talking and powerful, coercive magic. He needed to show them something that looked divine. Something awe-inspiring. He slowly started writhing and shaking, his body contorting as he grew bigger, larger, his bones cracking and reforming, as shimmering, obsidian black scales started appearing all over his skin. A moment later, he was no longer a man, but in the familiar, terrifyingly powerful form of a giant black dragon. He looked out over the vast, frozen lands he had just, in his own mind, claimed for himself, and then he roared. He roared louder than he ever had before, a sound of pure, primal power that shook the very mountains. And then, he went even further, enhancing his deafening roar with his own, immense magic. His roar washed over miles and miles of frozen, silent land, and he was pretty sure he probably caused somebody, somewhere, to piss themselves in sheer, unadulterated fright, but he didn't care. He waited patiently, his draconic eyes, glowing like twin emeralds, scouring the distant, snowy horizon. A minute later, he heard it. Another roar, this one much quieter, more distant, but still very similar to his own. A challenge. His draconic eyes quickly, instantly, zeroed in on the direction from where he thought he had heard the roar, before he raised his massive, leathery wings and started flapping. Soon, he was in the air, soaring over the vast, snow-covered forest as quickly as he could. Within half an hour of powerful, effortless flight, he was in the general area he thought the roar had originated from. His sharp eyes scoured the forest floor below, searching for any sign of movement, for any heat signatures big enough to be his target. He had only a moment's warning, a flicker of his magically enhanced senses, to feel the oncoming danger from above him. He quickly, instinctively, swerved hard to the right in mid-air, just in time to watch a brilliant, white blur shoot down past him, towards the forest floor, before it spread its own magnificent, feathered wings and flapped back up into the air, its movements silent and graceful. There it was! A white dragon! Harry started to circle the beautiful, deadly creature, as it did the same to him, the two of them sizing each other up in the cold, winter sky. He was impressed by what he saw. The white dragon was only about half of his own massive size, yet he could see a keen, sharp intelligence in its icy blue eyes, an intelligence that was far higher than that of other, more common dragons, except, perhaps, for their rare, golden brethren. It also seemed to be actively suppressing its presence, both physically and magically, making itself harder to track, harder to sense. It might be why they were so famously, and frustratingly, hard to find. While he was sizing the white dragon up, the creature seemed to be doing the exact same thing to him, its intelligent gaze sweeping over his own, much larger, darker form. Harry almost wanted to smirk, if a dragon could even smirk. It had been such a long, long time since he had battled another dragon, another being of comparable power and grace. This, he thought to himself, a thrill of pure, primal excitement coursing through him, is exactly what he needed to vent some of his long pent-up frustration. With that last, exhilarating thought, Harry took a sharp, sudden turn in the air and powered his way, a black, roaring missile, straight into the path of the circling white dragon. The white dragon, quick and agile, tried to dodge out of the way, but Harry, with his centuries of combat experience, had already predicted such a move from the creature and had already adjusted his own path, turning his massive body to intercept its new trajectory. He slammed, with the force of a battering ram, right into its torso, causing the smaller dragon to stagger in midair and briefly start to free fall before it managed to catch itself, its powerful wings beating frantically. But Harry was already on it, a relentless, black shadow, not giving it a single, precious moment to recover. He knew the white dragon was smaller, and most likely faster and more maneuverable than him, which was precisely why he needed to keep it engaged in close quarters, brutal combat, so it could not fly away and use its speed to its advantage. The white dragon turned to face Harry, its jaws opening, only to get a searing stream of molten hot, black fire straight in its beautiful, scaled face. It roared, a sound of both pure, unadulterated anger and searing pain, before launching its own, counter-stream of icy, crystalline breath. The two powerful, elemental streams, one of fire, one of ice, met in a hissing, steaming vortex between the two dragons, and successfully managed to keep Harry's fiery attack at bay. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 58, Chapter 58, First Dragon. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. The two powerful, elemental streams, one of fire, one of ice, met in a hissing, steaming vortex between the two dragons, and successfully managed to keep Harry's fiery attack at bay. Harry cut off his stream of fire as he fully flew past his adversary. He banked hard to the right and quickly moved to continue his relentless attack before the white dragon could try and escape. The smaller dragon, however, didn't seem to want to try and escape at all. To its credit, it too turned, with a defiant roar, and made to attack, its pride clearly wounded. Harry shifted his massive body, bringing his huge, razor-sharp claws in front of him, ready to dig into his opponent. He quickly shot another, shorter stream of fire directly into the dragon's face, forcing it to turn its head away, to flinch, and therefore become unable to properly dodge as Harry, once more, ran into him, digging his sharp, obsidian-like claws deep into the white dragon's side. The fact that Harry wouldn't let go of the now seriously injured, thrashing dragon forced them both to fall out of the sky, a tangled, roaring mess of black and white scales. They crashed through the tops of several tall, ancient pine trees before hitting the snowy ground with a deafening, earth-shaking thud. When they hit the ground, Harry was finally forced to let go, lest he get stuck in a dangerous, rolling tumble with the other, smaller dragon. He steadied himself and looked at his opponent. The white dragon was injured badly, its pristine, white side now stained a dark, ugly red from the deep claw marks Harry had left in it. It was struggling to get up as well, showing that one of its legs had been badly injured, probably broken, when they had crash-landed. Harry, with a slow, deliberate, and undeniably predatory grace, walked over to his defeated opponent. The white dragon watched him come, its icy blue eyes still filled with a stubborn, defiant fire, and it tried, with a weak, sputtering hiss, to shoot another stream of ice at him, to force Harry away. Harry, once more, easily combated it with a powerful stream of his own black fire, though he enhanced it with his own, considerable magic this time. The white dragon could not possibly hope to go up against the magically enhanced, impossibly hot fire that Harry was now spewing, and its weak, icy breath was soon, and completely, overwhelmed. When he heard the white dragon start to roar in genuine, agonizing pain from the intense, searing heat, he finally cut off the stream of fire. The white dragon's entire head was now blackened and scorched from his flames, and it panted heavily, its once proud body now limp and defeated on the snowy, broken ground. Harry reached it and, with a final, dominant gesture, put one of his massive, clawed forefeet firmly on its throat. He leaned down, his huge, black head inches from the white dragon's own, and roared, a loud, triumphant, and utterly terrifying sound, into the defeated dragon's face, a roar that probably scared all living creatures in a 30-mile radius far, far away from him. He saw, with a grim satisfaction, the white dragon flinch, and finally, submit, from his deafening, overpowering roar. Harry looked deep into the creature's intelligent, now fearful eyes. Dragons, he knew, didn't really form into packs or hierarchies of any kind, but they, even the proud, solitary dragons of this world, could be forced, through overwhelming, undeniable power, to submit to a much stronger opponent. And once they had truly submitted, Harry could then, with his own unique, powerful magic, reach into their minds and magically, almost permanently, cement a deep, primal loyalty to him, a loyalty based off of their own, deeply ingrained draconic instincts of power and dominance. He had gotten the idea from the ancient legends of his own world, about how the great wizard Merlin had supposedly tamed a dragon. He had, of course, tweaked and refined the concept over the long, lonely years, and had made a way for himself to use it, dragon to dragon. It was, after all, much easier for a proud, powerful creature like a dragon to think it was submitting to another, even more powerful dragon, as its considerable pride would be a lot harder to get around if it thought a puny, insignificant human had somehow managed to beat it. When Harry had finished the complex, magical submission of the creature, he morphed back into his familiar, and far less intimidating, human form. The white dragon, now lying quietly on the ground, looked confused for a moment, and then weakly gave him a few, tentative sniffs, before confirming, with a low, rumbling growl, that he was, indeed, still the same, overwhelmingly powerful creature that had just so thoroughly defeated it. Harry smirked as he moved to start healing the white dragon's considerable wounds. The dragon didn't try anything, didn't even flinch, as it felt the warm, soothing glow of Harry's powerful, life-giving magic reach out and begin to knit its torn flesh and mend its broken bones. It took close to 15 minutes of intense, focused magical healing to fully heal the dragon to his own, admittedly very high, satisfaction. The dragon moved, and then weakly, but successfully, tried to sit up, which it did, with a new, almost graceful ease. It looked at Harry, and Harry looked right back at the magnificent, now healed creature. "I'm not going to give you a name," Harry said, his voice calm and clear in the quiet, snowy forest. "Despite the fact that your obedience now belongs to me, you will still be you, in a very real sense, so to rename you would be an insult to your own identity." The dragon showed no outward sign that it had understood him, but Harry knew that it had, because he had also, as part of the submission process, magically connected their minds, so that he could, from now on, communicate with it, and all his other future draconic allies, telepathically. "You have no way of knowing this," Harry continued, almost talking to himself now, as he gently stroked the dragon's now smooth, unblemished white scales, "but you, my friend, will be my first, crucial step to achieving the greatest, most powerful fighting force this world has ever seen. You, and some of your other, equally magnificent brethren, that is. I have a feeling," he added, a grim, determined look on his face, "that I am going to need more than just a few of you to finally get that bastard, Emmer, to back off, and to leave Ciri alone, for good." The white dragon growled, a low, deep, menacing sound at the name, already picking up on its new master's intense, burning dislike for this Emmer. Harry smirked, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Ha," he said, looking out at the vast, frozen, and now conquered wilderness. "Let's go build an empire. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 59, Chapter 59, Frozen Dominion. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Far North. Harry's POV. Harry stared out into the vast, snow-covered clearing at all of his latest conquests. 5 of them. He had already, in the first 3 short months that he had been here in the far north, managed to track down and take control of 5 magnificent white dragons. He had been right about them, too. They possessed a much higher, more cunning level of intelligence than the common, more brutish dragons he had encountered in the south. After he had defeated and taken control of the first one's mind, getting it to willingly, if begrudgingly, follow him, the other white dragons in the area had clearly gotten the message. They had started to actively stay away from him, avoiding him as much as they possibly could. The next one had taken him a full 2 weeks to finally hunt down, simply because it was constantly on the move, never staying in one place for more than a day. Unfortunately for him, in a full-out, long-distance flight, the smaller, more streamlined white dragons were actually faster than he was in his larger, bulkier dragon form. So, if he couldn't get the initial jump on one, if he couldn't ambush it, then it would simply fly off before he even got a chance to do anything. He had, of course, used complex, long-range tracking charms to try and keep up with them, but even apparition didn't help that much, since they spent most of their time high up in the air, only coming down to rest and eat. And he, unfortunately, needed to do both of those things as well, which made it incredibly difficult to catch up to a creature that never seemed to tire. It didn't help, either, that they could apparently also sense magic to some extent, which, Harry should have guessed, since he already knew they could magically suppress their own presence to an extent. He hadn't confirmed it yet, but he also strongly believed that they possibly possessed some form of natural, chameleon-like camouflage ability, one that they utilized with the innate magic in their bodies to blend in with the snowy, white landscape. As annoying and as frustrating as all this was, it was also extremely, incredibly fascinating. He had not had the chance to study white dragons in any real depth until now, and they were definitely a truly fascinating, and highly unique, subspecies. He was now pretty sure that it was almost impossible for them to ever give birth to a golden dragon, simply because they actually used much of the ambient magic that they absorbed for their own survival, for their stealth and their speed. It also, he realized, explained why there were originally so few of them. They couldn't give birth to large litters of dragons like their southern cousins. They could only birth one, or perhaps two, hatchlings at a time, simply because they did not have enough excess, stored-up magic to successfully incubate any more than that. Eventually, though, after weeks of patient, relentless tracking, he had finally caught up with the second dragon, sneaking up on it while it was sleeping, coiled up in a hidden, snowy crevice. The battle had been quicker than the first one he had gone through, but it had been just as intense, just as brutal. Casting complex, non-draconic magic, beyond just strengthening his own fire breath, was annoyingly, almost impossibly, difficult while in his dragon form, so battle usually required actual, physical force and skillful, tactical maneuvering. The third dragon had been the most ferocious of the lot, and had also been the biggest white dragon he had, so far, had to face. It wasn't that much bigger than the others of its subspecies, but it was stronger, faster, and far more aggressive. Harry also suspected that it might have been younger, more reckless, than the first two that he had conquered. Despite its considerable physical strength, however, its mental fortitude, its willpower, was not nearly as strong as the first two. It had submitted much more quickly once defeated. The fourth and fifth were actually the easiest of the bunch, as they had, rather conveniently for him, already been fighting each other over some territorial dispute when Harry had swooped in, while they were both tired and weakened. They had been smart enough, he had to give them credit, to immediately set aside their own dispute to try and tag-team him, but it hadn't mattered much in their weakened, injured state. Harry was sure, though, that if they had both been at their full, uninjured strength, he would have had some actual, serious trouble on his hands. Or, well, claws. Now, he had led them all here, to this massive, secluded clearing. Harry had decided that this would be the place. This would be where he would build his first settlement, the place that would eventually become the capital, the very start, of his new, northern kingdom. His first, and most formidable, enemy was the relentless, biting cold. The biggest, most obvious issue with the fact that there were barely any people living out here in the far north, when compared to the other, more temperate kingdoms of the continent, was simply how unbelievably cold it was, all year round. No one, except for the absolute hardiest of people, wished to risk freezing, or starving to death, just to come and live out their lives in what was, for all intents and purposes, a barren, frozen wasteland. Now, making the entire far north warmer was a monumental, almost godlike task, a feat that was likely greater than even his considerable ability. But making this clearing, this specific area where he would build his first settlement, warm enough to comfortably live in, that would be doable. The first task would be to set up a magical perimeter, a massive, invisible dome, to keep the precious heat in, and to stop it from escaping out into the frozen wilderness. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 60, Chapter 60, Core of Survival. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. The first task would be to set up a magical perimeter, a massive, invisible dome, to keep the precious heat in, and to stop it from escaping out into the frozen wilderness. While his 5 newly subjugated dragons lazed about in the snow, their white scales blending in almost perfectly, Harry began to walk around the entire, vast perimeter of the clearing, setting up a large, complex ward. It was, at its core, actually a simple, common charm for magical insulation, one that he was now expanding, amplifying, and weaving into a full, permanent ward around the entire area. It took him several long, grueling hours to slowly circle the entire clearing, all while mentally, and continuously, casting the complex, multi-layered spell. When he finally finished, he reached out and touched his own magic to the newly created ward, testing its strength, its resilience, making sure it would not collapse, or even flicker, if some pesky, curious sorcerer or sorceress ever tried to mess with it. He would put up the more traditional, and more lethal, protection and anti-intruder wards a little later on in his planning. One of the next biggest, and equally important, problems he had to solve in the far north was the severe lack of readily available food. There was plenty of wild game, to be sure, but not nearly enough to support a real, growing population of humans. Especially not a settled, non-nomadic population. There were two main ways to fix this problem, he knew. He needed to make it possible to grow more crops, and he needed to make sure there was more game available for hunting. Harry knew, better than any other human currently alive on this world, how incredibly dangerous it was to just carelessly mess with natural ecosystems. So, he would have to do this very, very carefully, proportionally scaling up the entire local ecosystem without actually making it physically bigger. The trees and the plants in the area would need to be magically encouraged to produce more fruit, more seeds, more leaves, which would, in turn, provide more food for the small animals and the various herbivores who ate them. This, in turn, would help their populations to rise, which would, in turn, help the omnivore and the carnivore populations to rise as well, creating a richer, more vibrant food chain. Of course, it wasn't quite that simple. He would have to use his powerful, life-giving magic to make the plants grow stronger, hardier, and he would have to magically encourage the local animal populations to fornicate a little more frequently than they usually would. But it was, he knew, possible. Harry got started by finding a large, solitary boulder in the center of the clearing and going to work on transfiguring it. He thought, with intense, focused concentration, about the exact shape, the exact size, the exact intricate details of what he wanted to create. He quickly started to sweat, despite the freezing air, just from the sheer amount of raw, focused magical concentration he had to put into this particular, highly complex act of transfiguration. After nearly 10 long, uninterrupted minutes of pure, focused willpower, he finally opened his eyes. In front of him, where there had once been a large, unremarkable stone, now sat what looked like a massive, perfectly spherical container. At a closer look, the container appeared to be made out of a strange, shifting, mixed color of copper and bronze. Running his hands along its smooth, seamless surface, Harry couldn't feel a single, minute imperfection. Despite its distinct metallic sheen, however, the object itself wasn't actually made out of metal. It was much closer to obsidian in its inherent properties and incredible, almost unbreakable, strength than anything else. He had never bothered to come up with a proper name for this unique, magically created material, and he decided not to start now, either. The primary purpose of his new, strange creation was to act as a kind of body, a central core, in a sense, for a highly complex, multi-layered matrix of runic arrays that he was about to wrap over its entire surface. The material was impressively, almost absurdly, strong, but even more impressive was its incredible ability to conduct raw, untamed magic. It was, in fact, the second strongest magical conductor Harry had ever seen or worked with, right next to the legendary, almost mythical, mithril of his own world. He pressed his hand against the sphere's smooth surface, and it sunk in, rippling, as if it were made of a dense, viscous liquid rather than the solid, unyielding material it actually was. Almost immediately, the entire sphere began to glow with a soft, ethereal, teal-blue light, a light that attracted the temporary, curious attention of his 5, still blazing white dragons. Harry watched carefully as tiny, glowing, intricate symbols began to slowly etch themselves onto the surface of the sphere, glowing with the same vibrant, teal color as the current aura surrounding the object. The runes were in several different, ancient and long-forgotten languages, and none of them, crucially, were from this world. Harry didn't ever want this powerful, and potentially world-altering, device to fall into the hands of his enemies, but if it somehow did, they wouldn't be able to understand it, activate it, or manipulate it in any way. The actual, delicate process of imbuing the sphere with the runic arrays was both incredibly long and mind-numbingly tedious, and it even had a small, but not insignificant, chance of not working at all, of catastrophically failing. He had, technically, never actually attempted to create something of this scale and complexity before. He had only ever researched the concept, the theory, in his copious free time over the long, lonely decades. He was confident it would work, though. His math, his intricate magical calculations, were usually, almost always, correct. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 61, Chapter 61, Razai. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. After several more long, mentally exhausting hours, the intricate, multi-layered etchings were finally done, and the sphere's brilliant, teal glow slowly faded. Harry stood back and looked at the now finished product, a faint, proud smile on his face. It was something else he had not yet bothered to name, but its primary function was the complete, and total, manipulation of entire biomes, right down to a microscopic, cellular level. If he wanted to, with this single, powerful device, he could probably turn half of the frozen, barren far north into a lush, tropical desert. It affected not only the ground, the very soil itself, but also the air, and even the atmosphere, within a certain, considerable distance. It was something that could end up being truly, apocalyptically dangerous in enemy hands. Perhaps, he thought to himself, he should leave a few nasty, hidden traps on it, just in case, for anyone who might be foolish enough to attempt to use it without his permission. Yes, it was always better to be safe than sorry. A few more moments of silent, focused work, and the sphere was finally, completely complete, its hidden traps and magical booby traps now in place. Now, all he needed was to give it a proper name. He mused, tapping his chin thoughtfully. Gaia's sphere? No, that's a bit too long, too on the nose. The ball of creation? Ugh, that just sounds incredibly lame. Razai? Not bad, actually. It's certainly better than anything else I've thought of so far. All right, it's settled then. I will officially call you Razai, at least until I can think of something better. The sphere, in response to his words, gave off what looked like a single, soft, silent pulse of teal light. Harry smiled at the seemingly sentient action. Good, he said, patting the smooth, warm surface of the sphere. With that little matter settled, I now need to start on the exoskeleton of the settlement. Harry looked down at the sun, which had just dipped below the snow-dusted tips of the tall, ancient trees. Perhaps tomorrow, Harry thought to himself, a wave of sudden, bone-deep exhaustion washing over him. He moved closer to his 5 dragons, who seemed to already be on their way to sleep for the night, their massive, white forms coiled up in the snow. He pulled his shrunken trunk from its chain around his neck and, with a whisper of magic, restored it to its full size, retrieving his comfortable, magically expanded traveling tent from within. He entered the tent and breathed a deep, weary sigh of relief. The truth was, creating Razai, from scratch, had been both incredibly magically and mentally taxing, more so than almost anything else he had ever created before. Harry moved to his comfortable, magically softened bed and immediately laid down on it, a groan of pure relief escaping his lips at feeling its welcoming softness. Almost as soon as his eyes closed, he was gone, pulled down into the deep, welcoming land of dreams. Harry didn't dream very often anymore. Most of his past experiences with dreams, especially from his tumultuous childhood, had been, almost without exception, terrifying nightmares. This was why he was so pleasantly, wonderfully surprised by the current dream he was having. He was back in Potter Manor, in the familiar, comfortable living room. He hardly even recognized it at first, as he hadn't truly, properly thought of the place in many, many years. There was a warm, cheerful fire lit in the grand fireplace, casting the entire room in a soft, welcoming, orange light. However, the thing that most immediately, and completely, gained his attention was the welcome presence of another person, curled up, warm and content, on his side. Harry could immediately, instantly, tell who it was. He had, after all, painstakingly memorized every single, perfect feature of hers from their precious time together, all those years ago. It was Ciri. His Ciri. Not the small, frightened little girl who he had been protecting from the shadows for the past few years, but the fierce, vibrant, beautiful young woman who he had saved, and who, in turn, had saved him, all those many, many years ago. She seemed to sense his gaze on her, and she looked up at him, her beautiful, emerald green eyes meeting his own. And then, she smiled, a soft, gentle, loving smile that made his heart ache with a familiar, bittersweet longing. Harry returned the smile as he looked deep into her eyes. He felt a familiar, pleasant tingle go up his spine while looking at her, a feeling of pure, unadulterated rightness. Eventually, she stopped staring and returned to nuzzling her head into the crook of his chest. Harry, in the dream, wrapped his arm around her shoulder and brought her even closer to him. He sighed in pure, blissful content. This was the reason he had done so much, for so very, very long. This feeling. The peace, the contentment, the pure, unadulterated happiness, it felt like it penetrated his very soul, like the most powerful, most addictive drug imaginable. It was a feeling he had never, not once, been able to replicate for more than a century now, yet even just her simple, imagined presence in his dreams could accomplish it, so easily. He stayed like that in his dream, for what felt like a wonderful, blissful eternity, wrapped around her, and her him. He blinked, as he stared down at her short, beautiful ashen hair, and then, suddenly, it was over. He was no longer staring down at her, but at a faded, tan-colored cloth. The rough, canvas top of his tent, to be precise. The wonderful, overwhelming feelings of peace and contentment were gone, as if they had never been, like a fleeting whisper in the wind. Harry growled, a low, guttural sound of pure, raw frustration, and shot up out of his bed. He threw a furious, grief-stricken punch at the nearest wall of his tent, and watched, with a detached, angry surprise, as a wave of uncontrolled, fiery magic shot out from his fist and burned an entire wall of his magically reinforced tent to a blackened crisp. He growled again, this time a sound of pure, unadulterated annoyance, rather than frustration. "God damn it," he whispered to himself, his voice rough. Out of the new, gaping hole in his tent, he could see his 5 draconic companions looking at him, their intelligent eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and curiosity, before they went back to tearing apart whatever unfortunate prey they had managed to catch for their breakfast that particular morning. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Chapter 62, Chapter 62, First Offer. If you want to read ahead by 15+ chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. Harry made quick work of magically repairing his burned tent before sitting down to eat a quick breakfast of dried meat and stale bread. After that, he took a quick, bracingly cold bath in a nearby stream before packing the tent away once more and looking out into the vast, empty clearing. The first thing he wanted to do, the first real step in building his new home, would be to make a tower. It would serve the practical purpose of housing him and hosting any future visitors he might wish to entertain. More importantly, though, it would also house the newly created Razai. It would be hidden, safe and secure, right at the very tip of the tower, with a specially designed conducting pillar going straight down the entire length of the structure, a pillar that would also cleverly double as the main support beam for the entire tower. He would, of course, change the outward appearance of Razai, disguise it with layers of illusion and misdirection charms, to make it look less suspicious, even to other powerful sorcerers who might one day see it. The tower, he decided, would also double as a powerful, awe-inspiring symbol to his new people, another tangible thing that would help to assert his right to rule. That is precisely why he would make it almost entirely out of a strange, shimmering metal, a material of his own creation. Something that had never been seen or done before in this particular time, in this particular world. It would not look like the clunky, blocky buildings of his home world, or the crude, stone castles of this one. He had a much sleeker, more elegant idea in mind. It would look like a thin, smooth, almost seamless pyramid, one that soared 1,000 feet into the clear, northern air. Unfortunately, he had absolutely no idea how to actually make such a complex, and frankly, gravity-defying, structure in a way that would be structurally sound. He might be able to do so with magic, with powerful, permanent transfiguration and reinforcement charms, but he wouldn't even know where to begin with a project of that sheer scale. Making the raw materials, however, should not be a problem. He could, quite easily, magically create and sustain several large, highly efficient forges and have them constantly, tirelessly pumping out high-quality metals with almost no effort. He already knew, from his previous explorations, where several large, untapped iron veins were located in these mountains, as well as some smaller deposits of silver, and even a little bit of gold. He could certainly use some skilled miners and other craftsmen to help with that. But making all that raw metal into something usable, something refined and workable, that would take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and assloads of magic. With a sigh, Harry looked at his 5, now attentive white dragons and, with a silent, telepathic command, ordered them to stay put. He doubted any of them would be able to disobey his magically enforced command, but just in case, he had placed subtle, but powerful, tracking charms on all of them. With that, he operated away, leaving the frozen, silent clearing behind, heading further south, back towards the lands of actual, civilized kingdoms. It wasn't long before he was standing once more on the high, windy peaks of the Dragon Mountains, looking down at the scattered, patchwork quilt of the northern realms. There were tons of places he could start his recruitment drive, but the first one he had in mind would be the small, struggling, and rather desperate settlement of Duskband. Duskband wasn't a real, established settlement, to be honest. The 200 or so people who lived there were, for the most part, outcasts, refugees, and desperate souls who had nowhere else to go. They used the harsh, unforgiving lands of the far north as a means of meager income, either through dangerous mining operations in the mountains, or through carpentry, trapping, and other such trades. The little, ramshackle huts they called houses barely kept them protected from the harsh, biting elements, and looked like they might fall over at any second. They were currently camped on the southern side of the mountains because it was the middle of the harsh winter season, making it almost impossible to live any further north. But they wouldn't be able to stay here for too long either, otherwise, bandits would eventually find and rob them, or some greedy, local noble would, and try to tax them into oblivion. They would be the perfect, and most receptive, group to introduce first to his new, magically warmed little haven. They were already somewhat familiar with the harsh realities of the far north, and they would be much more willing, he reasoned, to start a new, more prosperous life, due to the fact that they were constantly having to deal with unwanted hardship, with bandits and asshole nobles constantly trying to rob and take advantage of them. Harry approached to a spot near the makeshift camp and walked into it, his demeanor calm and unthreatening. People seemed to be busy, working hard with their meager, winter-hardy crops and taking care of the few, scrawny animals they had. He saw that he was getting strange, suspicious looks from the people, but they didn't approach him or say anything, they just kept a wary eye on him as they continued with their work. Eventually, a tall, broad-shouldered man approached him, his expression cautious. "Welcome, traveler," the man said, his voice a deep, booming baritone. "I have not seen you in these parts before. What brings you to our humble camp?" Harry looked up at the surprisingly tall and beefy man. He had a thick, fiery red beard and bright, intelligent brown eyes. Harry estimated him to be at the start of his 40s. As soon as the man had spoken to him, the entire settlement seemed to focus their attention on them. It was clear they had all just been pretending not to pay attention before, but their attempts at subtlety were practically non-existent. "Greetings to you as well," Harry said politely, offering the man a small, friendly smile. "I am Hadrian Black. I wish to talk with the leader of this settlement, if that is at all possible." It was very important, Harry knew, that he not make anything he said sound like a demand. These people, beaten down and wary as they were, would see it as him just being another powerful figure trying to take advantage of them. The red-bearded man eyed him for a long, searching moment, before finally, with a curt nod, leading him over to a large tent that appeared slightly bigger than the rest. Entering it, Harry found it to be only slightly warmer than the freezing air outside, and mostly empty, save for a simple bed, a few rough-hewn chairs, a small, wobbly table, and a small, locked chest where the man likely stored his meager belongings. "So," the man said, his friendly demeanor gone, replaced by a much more wary, almost hostile one, as he eyed Harry up and down. "What brings you to me, little lordling?" Harry's lips twitched upwards at the man's rather obvious, and frankly, clumsy, attempt to anger him, to get a rise out of him. "I wanted to give you an offer," Harry said, not rising to the man's bait and continuing on in his polite, respectful tone. "Well, perhaps it's more of a deal, really. A deal that I believe would be mutually beneficial to both of us. If you were interested in hearing it, of course." The man frowned and looked on suspiciously at him, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Harry didn't let it bother him. He just continued to look calmly into the man's eyes, his own expression open and honest. "Let's hear it then," the big man said back to him, his voice a low grumble. "I will not beat around the bush," Harry said, getting straight to the point. "I am attempting to start a new kingdom. A kingdom of true equality, where everyone will be given rights, and everyone will be treated fairly, regardless of their station, or their race. I can do a fair bit of starting it up all by myself, but a kingdom, as you know, is nothing without its citizens. I am here to offer you, and all of your people, protection and a real, permanent home, for free. I can make your crops plentiful, your animals grow strong and healthy, and your homes warm and safe. All I ask for, in return, is that you and your people join my new kingdom, as its first citizens. The man looked at him for a long, silent moment. Are you sick in the head, boy? He finally asked, his voice flat. No, Harry said, his polite smile not wavering. And I am not a boy. I am, in fact, much older than you are. I'm a sorcerer. Immediately upon the admission of that one single word, the man's eyes became guarded, hostile. A sorcerer, he repeated, his voice filled with a deep-seated suspicion and distaste. A bloody sorcerer is trying to start his own kingdom now? The man asked, as if the very idea of it was a personal, deeply offensive insult to him. If you want to read ahead by 15 plus chapters from her, you can visit my Patreon. Patreon. https://www.patreon.com/Yggdrasil_Loki. New chapter is coming soon. Write a review.